Okay, so first of all, thank you to Emma and Rob and Sam and everybody at the TAFSIG for inviting me. I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research, which looked into the effect of input medium on an integrated EAP listening into writing test. Apart from saying thanks to Emma and the TAFSIG, a couple of other thanks go to the British Council, who actually funded part of my PhD study before I started working for them through the Assessment Research Awards and Grants scheme. So if anybody is doing a PhD and is interested in looking to get some funding, do Google Assessment Research Awards and Grants scheme, and you'll see when the calls come out, and we do fund those as well. Thanks also to Professor Tony Green and Dr. John Field, who were my supervisors, always willing to give advice and feedback, which was extremely, well, highly appreciated. And I've got to say thanks to everyone in the ARG team, including now, I'm delighted to say, Emma, who has recently joined us. Without those guys constantly pushing me to get this done, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now. So those are the thanks. So we'll get straight into it. I'm going to talk to you briefly about the sort of the background and the literature review. Then I'll look at the methodology. I'll give you some of the results, and we'll talk about some of the implications and the conclusions that came out of this. So the background to this really, as Emma said, I started off, well, not started off, but I was a lecturer of EAP for many years. And I do a lot of work in Russia and also the Ukraine, where there's a big push towards internationalization. And working in the EAP domain, I was sort of concerned that a lot of tests test individual skills. So traditionally, we've seen this idea of the 4 skills tests. But actually what we see in the EAP world is the need to integrate those tests. And there are good reasons for that. One of them is the fact that integrating skills is more authentic. That's what students have to do. It builds on an interactionist approach to language acquisition. And Sean, we back in 2007 were arguing back then, and probably earlier as well, in fact, that real life performance is the criterion of choice against which we should be judging tasks. So that's kind of where my interest in integrated tasks came from, but also more and more we see, and I have to say this research has started long before coronavirus was even thought of or heard of, but we were already seeing a move from the traditional classroom to the flipped classroom. So instead of students sitting in lecture theatres and listening to people perform in inverted commas a lecture live, we were seeing more and more that the input was being delivered outside of the classroom, possibly in a recorded format, and then students would come together in the classroom for more interactive tasks. And I started thinking about, you know, what is the best thing to do? Is it better to have that input produced as a podcast, so as a video with a PowerPoint, or actually as a podcast? And, you know, how do those different input formats affect our students? So that's kind of the background to it. In terms of what's been done in the literature, lots of research has looked at different factors affecting listening, things like anxiety, the number of playbacks, accent, speech rate, and so on. Lots of work has looked at input formats in listening tests as discrete tests, and the preferences there have been quite varied. So the findings from the different studies have been really quite mixed. So some people said they preferred video. In some studies, for example, Koniam, he found that feedback regarding the input formats were mixed. But Wagner, for example, in 2010 found that students performed significantly better when they had video input compared to only audio input. Other research has looked at the use of captions. And for example, Montero Perez et al. Back in 2013 did a study where their students were presented with video input without captions, with captions, and with keyword captions. And they found that the with full captions group outperformed the other groups on global comprehension, but not necessarily on the detailed comprehension questions. So there's been quite a mixture of work done around different formats. And obviously there's been work done on academic listening and note-taking and what affects performance on academic listening in terms of how people take notes and what the content is, for example, using discourse markers and how a very well-structured lecture can affect people's understanding. So there's been a lot of research done around the sort of the listening side. In terms of the writing, obviously, I'm sure there's lots of work being done around different models of writing, writing as product, writing as process, writing as social interaction. You've got Scardamalia and Bayreiter's quite influential model of knowledge telling versus knowledge transformation, which is really quite important in the academic world. And then other work has looked at comparing independent and integrated tasks, whereby a lot of people have argued towards integrated tasks because they are more reflective of university writing. So then a lot of work has been done on integrated writing tasks, looking at reading into writing. Some work has been done on listening and reading into writing, but a lot of that has been around the TOEFL IBT. But very few studies have actually looked purely at listening into writing. So you can see there are a couple of studies there, but most of the work on integrated writing has focused on reading into writing. So I thought, well, actually, this would be quite interesting given the situation with the flipped learning or the changes towards flipped learning. This would be quite interesting to look at. So out of the literature review and my interests, I came up with two questions. One of them is, how does performance on an integrated listening into writing EAP task differ when test takers are presented with lecture input in the form of a podcast or a vodcast? And to what extent are test takers influenced by the written word in an EAP lecture compared to the spoken word? So the students that I had for this were from two universities. One was in the Russian Federation and one was in the Ukraine. I had more than 116 participants originally, but by the time I got rid of those people who didn't write anything or didn't sign ethics forms and things like that, I was left with 116 participants, which divided perfectly into two groups of 58 students. You can see from this information that there were 88 females and 26 males. That's obviously quite heavy on the females, but that's also very typical of the kind of students that study languages in these countries. So it's very female dominated. And we had self-declared language levels from A1 up to C1. And I say self-declared, but they were in groups where the teachers had said, you know, this is a B1 class, these students are A2 and so on. So it was only kind of semi-self-declared, really. So what did I do? Well, the methodology really comprised 4 different areas, if you like. To start with, all the participants took a short lexicogrammatical placement test. That was the Oxford Quick Placement Test. And the scores for that were used to divide the participants into 2 groups of approximately equal ability. After that, the students were given 2 halves of an EAP lecture. So one half was presented just as a podcast, so they didn't see anything, they just saw a black screen and they heard the audio. The second half was presented as a video. Now, this was actually a counterbalanced measures design. So half of them got the audio first, followed by the video, and the other half got the video first, followed by the audio. But the words that were spoken were exactly the same in both formats. The total length of the lecture was about 13 minutes. So it wasn't a full 1 hour lecture, it was a 13-minute lecture, and they took notes on the two halves. And then they used their notes to write a summary of the lecture. They had about 45 minutes to do that, and they were expected to write around about 350 words approximately. Then after that, they all completed a post-task questionnaire, which gave me data like you've just seen about the participants, their gender and so on, but also about their perceptions of the actual tasks that they'd done. So I'm going to focus mainly on tasks 2 and 3, if you like, but I will be giving you a little bit of information about the first task, the lexico-grammatical placement test, and also a little bit about the post-task feedback questionnaire. Okay, so let's move on to the input. So the input was 12 minutes and 42 seconds in length in total. Of that, 33 seconds were introduction and outline, and 9 seconds formed the close of the lecture. So there were actually 12 minutes of content, and that was broken down into part 1, which was 6 minutes and 14 seconds, and part 2, which was 5 minutes 46. There were 3 slides in each of those parts, in each part, one slide had 1 sentence, one slide had 5 bullet points, and one had a diagram showing 5 keywords. So the idea was to see to have the two halves as equal as possible, and to see how people reacted to the video compared to the audio, and how they used the input that was on the video. To make sure that the two halves were as close together as possible in terms of difficulty and complexity and length and everything, the cleaned input was analysed using Text Inspector. And when I say cleaned, I mean I removed repeated sounds and false starts, such as "we were probably," or and I then. So these kinds of false starts were removed, but hesitations like and were left in. Now, Text Inspector, if you're not aware of it, is an automated textual analysis tool, which provides analyses based on descriptive statistics such as length and number of sentences, number of words, syllables per sentence, type token ratio. It also gives information about various corpora, such as the BNC, the COCA, and it gives information about the level of words according to English Vocabulary Profile. It also includes information about academic word list words, and gives information about discourse markers, meta discourse markers, such as person markers, code gloss markers, relational markers, and so on. So the results of that analysis are here. Excuse me. So what you can see from this is that the two halves of the lecture were generally very, very similar. The word count in part 1 was 1,108 words compared to 1,048 in part 2. The type count was 290 compared to 277. But everything else was, you can see very, very similar. The lexical diversity was ever so slightly higher, or slightly more complex, if you like, in part 2, but again, they were very, very similar. The only major difference is down here on AWL all tokens percentage. There were 4.98% of AWL words per 100 in part 1 and 8.2 in part 2. So that might give a little clue that maybe it was a bit more difficult, but in principle, it was as close as it could be. And the speech rate was pretty much exactly the same in both halves as well. So let's move on to the results. As I said, everybody did the quick placement test, the QPT, to start with, just so that I could put them into two groups. The means were very similar across the two groups, and a t-test showed that there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. So that was encouraging, because then I knew that any differences that came out weren't just because they were of a different level, it was related to other aspects. So when the students wrote their lecture, the two halves of the lecture, so the summary, were split into two halves, and the three raters rated each half of the summary. So the first half was relating to the input that they'd had in the first half, and the second half related to the input that they'd had in the second half. Not all raters rated all scripts, but there was plenty of overlap between the raters. In some cases, the papers were marked twice. In some cases, they were marked 3 times. And in a few cases, they were marked once, but the vast majority were marked at least twice. So you can see from the rash analysis that was carried out that the raters were all within a good fit. They ranged between 0.85 and 1.08 in terms of the infit mean square, and from 0.78 to 0.96 in terms of the outfit mean square. So that means there was a good fit, and the rate of reliability was quite high. Excuse me. In terms of the results then, so RQ1, just to remind you, was how does performance differ when test takers have lecture input in the form of a podcast or a vodcast? So to work this out, I used Hotelling's T2, which is a variation on a one-way maneuver. I couldn't use the one-way maneuver as there were only 2 groups. And there were 2 dependent variables, so it wasn't wise to use an independent t-test either, just because of the risk of a type 1 error. So I ran the Hotelling's T-squared, and what you can see is that the scores for the audio first group, the mean score on the first part, which was the audio input, was 4.006. The mean for the video input, which was their second part, was 3.571. And both of those scores are ever so slightly higher than the video first group, who had a mean of 3.452 when they had the video input, but the scores dropped down to 2.886 in the audio input. And when I ran the tests, I found that there was a statistically significant difference between the groups on the combined dependent variables, where F was 17.832, and that was significant at 0.0005, with a Wilks lambda of 0.760 and a partial eta squared of 0.240, and a Bonferroni adjusted alpha level of 0.025 was used with a simultaneous 95% confidence level. So basically, the Bonferroni adjustment was used to avoid any distortion that comes from, or that would have come from, using multiple t-tests. Now, because there was a statistically significant difference on the combined dependent variables, post hoc independent samples t-tests were run. And this showed that between the audio scores, so the audio is the blue line here, the red number, if you remember, was the audio first group, and the purple number here is the video first group. Here there was a statistically significant difference between performance on the input. So in this case, it was the first input, and in where the first group scored 4.006, but the video first group had it as the second input, and their scores were somewhat lower, significantly lower at 2.866. What you can see, though, is for the audio first group, the video input was actually quite similar to the video first group with 3.571 compared to 3.452. So there was no significant difference in mean video scores across the two groups, whether that came as the first input or the second input. But the combined group means were statistically significantly different. So what that tells us is that people performed better when they had the audio input as the first input, but when the audio input came as the second input, they performed significantly worse than if it was the first input. What you can see, though, is obviously, as I mentioned, that the performance drops off in both cases in the second half. And there could be a number of reasons for this. One reason could be just a fatigue effect. So it could be, for example, that the audio first group was more focused when they just had audio. But as they got a little bit more tired, they had video to support them a little bit, but the scores dropped off. Whereas with the video first group, they had that support from the video, but then when they lost it, that had a more considerable impact on their scores. And it could also have just been the simple change of input type. So the removal of visual support may have impacted negatively on the video first group. So another aspect of the first RQ1, so of RQ1, was to look at the actual text that students presented or produced. So to do this, I ran text inspector analyses on all the texts in the same way as I had done for the lecture. And these were the different analyses that I focused on. So I focused on sentence count, sentence length, token and type count, type token ratio, Flesch-Kincaid, reading ease, lexical diversity. I also looked at the percentage of words at the different CEFR levels, and I looked at the percentage of types and tokens from the academic word list. But I'm going to focus on these ones. I'm not going to go into the CEFR levels just because it's a lot of data, and you'll see just with what I'm giving you now, there's a lot of data to look at and to comment on. Okay, so these were the results. What I did here, just to explain this to you, is instead of talking about group 1 and group 2 or audio first group versus video first group, I sort of renamed them, if you like, to make it clear what group and what input format we were talking about. So group AF in the first two boxes is the audio first group. AFAI relates to the audio first group when they received audio input. AFBI relates to the audio first group when they received video input. The video first video input then is the second group, and video with the first input type, and video first audio input is the second group with the second input type, which was audio in this case. So you can see that for sentence count, token count, and type count, the audio first group had the highest mean, which is what we would expect from the previous results that we saw. But they had the highest mean average sentence length on the video input. At the other end of the scale, we can see that the video first audio input had the lowest means for those first four measures. And again, that's kind of what we would expect going off the Hotelling's T-squared results. If we look at type token ratio, though, we see that the highest number is in the video first audio input. But what we should be aware of here is that it's much easier to score a higher type token ratio value with shorter texts. So you can see that the token count in the fourth group, in the video first audio input, the token count mean was only 82.569. So that was considerably shorter than the 195.175 that the audio first audio input group were producing, and also shorter than the other two groups in inverted commas. So although it looks like they've got the highest type token ratio, that might not actually be the case. What we see, though, if we look at the flesh reading ease and the lexical diversity, is that both groups performed better when they had the video input. So they both had more complex texts when they had the video input compared to the audio input. The last number there that's in red, the 67.42, is in red because if you're not familiar with lexical diversity, MTLD, this is only analysed when there are texts of over 100 words. So in this case, only 48 of the 58 students wrote texts of over 100 words. So 10 of the students, if you like, were omitted from that analysis. So obviously, if all of the texts had been included, that might have been a different result, but it makes it look like of the stronger students that were included, they were all very similar across the different groups and across the input formats. But as I say, what we can see is that in both cases, for the flesh reading ease and lexical diversity, students actually produced more complex texts when they had access to the video input. Moving on then to the academic word list, we can see the same pattern here as well. The percentage of academic word list types and tokens, again, was higher in both groups when they had access to the video, and in both cases was somewhat lower when they only had access to the audio. So those were the results for RQ1. Let's move on to RQ2. Just to remind you, this was looking at the extent to which test takers were influenced by the written word, so what was on the slides in the EAP lecture compared to the spoken word. And we've already seen a little bit of that in terms of the fact that they seem to produce more complex texts when they have that access to the video compared to when they don't, but we'll have a look at it in a little more detail in this RQ. So in this case, all the papers were coded for the qualitative analysis. The number and types of propositions that test takers reproduced was counted, and each matching proposition was coded according to the type of input. So that's whether it came from the audio input or from the PowerPoint slide. According to the length of the match, so whether it was a word match, a clause length match, or a sentence level match, and the type of reproduction, whether it was an exact match or a paraphrase. And this is the coding scheme then that the coders used. In terms of the results, as we would expect, possibly, the audio first group performed better in part one. So the numbers highlighted in green are the higher numbers. The only exception to this, interestingly, was that the video first group produced more audio sentence level exact matches with 9. That's the box highlighted in yellow. Of course, in part one, the video first group had access to the slides on the video. So you can see from the code starting with S, they took advantage of what was on the slides, with 176 word level exact matches and 69 clause level exact matches and 16 sentence level exact matches. Now, what we can see is that the clause level exact matches that the audio first group produced was 63. The clause level exact matches then that the video first group produced was 24 from the audio and 69 from the video. So they've produced more clause level exact matches from the video, which suggests that they're copying from the slides, but they're also using the audio to some extent, which results in them producing almost 50% more clause level exact matches in total compared to the audio first group. If we move on to the second part, we can see that the results are a bit more mixed. So here, the audio first group still produces more paraphrases at the word level, the sentence level, and produces more exact word level matches. But the video first group produces more, slightly more, only 2 more, but ever so slightly more clause level paraphrases, but produces more clause level and sentence level exact matches. So again, the test takers here are obviously listening out for exact word matches and writing these down either as words, as clauses, or as sentences. Now, of course, in part 2, the audio first group also had access to the slides in the video. And again, you can see that they've taken advantage of that quite a lot, producing 107 word level exact matches, 71 exact clause level matches, and 6 exact sentence level matches. So we can see that the clause level paraphrases are actually the way that people reproduce paraphrase. So they don't tend to paraphrase words as much. They don't tend to paraphrase sentences as much. If they're paraphrasing at the clause level. But in terms of reproducing exact matches, there were a lot more word level exact matches and, well, far more word level matches, but also a lot of clause level exact matches. So when I got this data, I then did a more in-depth qualitative analysis of just 30 scripts, looking at the different proficiency levels across the 2 parts. So I had 30 scripts from part 1 across different proficiency levels and 30 scripts from part 2 across different proficiency levels, because I wanted to see what exactly was going on and who was producing what. And what I found was that the majority of test takers, especially those around the A2 to B1 levels, they were the ones that were influenced by the written word when it was available more. The very low level learners, so the A0 to, so pre-A1, if you like, and A1, didn't seem to pay as much attention to the information on the PowerPoint slides as those at the intermediate or above level. That's probably because of the cognitive load, or the overload, I should say, the cognitive overload that they were experiencing. Whereas, perhaps unsurprisingly, the higher level learners seemed to be the ones that were paraphrasing more. So while they reproduced the information that was on the slide, they paraphrased it more, so it was less clear cut, let's say, whether it came from the audio or from the slides. And what also seemed to distinguish the higher level learners was that not only did they reproduce the ideas, but they also combined the information from the lecture with other language, such as linking phrases, introductions, conclusions, and so on, to make the text sound like it was a more natural, complete whole text, rather than just a list of reproduced facts. And these findings are actually in line with other studies, for example, Robin 2007 and Vandergrift 2004, where they found that lower level learners performed better with the help of written texts, but they struggled then when this support was removed. But as I say, that's the when I say lower level, I don't mean the very low level, I mean the sort of A2 to B1 level, as opposed to the pre-A1 and A1. So those were the results for RQ2. Moving on to the next question that was concerning me, if you like, which wasn't strictly speaking an RQ, but it was something I was interested in terms of recommendations. I wanted to know, what did the test takers think of the input formats? So as you saw already, and as I mentioned, all the test takers did a feedback questionnaire to find out about their personal data, like their background, their language level, gender, and so on, but also to find out whether they thought that the tasks were representative of how they would perform in a normal listening or reading test, and also to find out what their preferences were about which part they performed better on and why, and which part they performed worse on and why. So the reasons for the best performance are shown here. The big blue chunk is demonstrates the fact that 33% of the test takers thought that the text or the visual helped them. And another 8%, that's the yellow chunk, thought that the video was better perceived. Now, those are their words, not mine, but how I interpret that is that they could take the information on board better when they had access to the video. On the other hand, the grey slice there of 15%, those were the test takers who thought that listening on its own was easier. So you've got 33% plus 8%, you've got 41% of learners who felt that they performed better because they had access to the video, and 15% felt that they performed better when they only had to worry about listening. And then, as you can see, there are a couple of other reasons that were given as well. So these were the qualitative answers from the questionnaire, and they were grouped together under these themes. The reasons that people gave, or some of the statements that they gave, in terms of preferring the video input, they said things like, I was able to see the slides in the presentation, there was visual material, I could both listen and read the information, and I felt that this was better because there were slides that improved the understanding and because the visual perception helped to focus. So these were what the test takers thought had helped them to perform better with video. Those who felt that they performed better with the audio said statements like, I focused only on listening, or I didn't waste my concentration on the pictures. So you can see that there's a bit of a mixture. So I also asked them why they thought they performed worse on a given input format. And there were actually a lot more reasons for the worst performance that they gave here. But again, we can see that 21% said specifically that listening only was more difficult, whereas 14, that's the orange chunk, whereas 14%, that's the yellow chunk, said that watching and listening is difficult, and or they were distracted by the video. There were, as I say, there were a lot more reasons for why people performed worse. That could be because of the bad acoustics, because they were tired, because they perceived the speech rate to be too quick. Some actually perceived the speech rate to be too quick in the audio only input format, even though it was the same speed, whether it was audio input or video input. So that was kind of interesting, that they just perceived that it was too quick when they only had access to the audio. But what we can see here again is that 21% felt that listening only was more difficult, whereas 14% felt that it was more difficult if they had the audio. So again, what were they actually saying in terms of the audio input making them perform worse? They said it didn't concentration my attention. So those were their words, not mine. It's difficult for me to understand information from audio. The audio information is much more difficult. This one I thought was interesting because, as we've seen, the information was actually very, very similar. And I badly remember information when I listen. And again, that's not surprising because we know from the research on working memory that it's very difficult to remember something if your cognitive processes are focusing on decoding at the word level. So it's only as your decoding processes become more automatic that you're able to remember more and more of what you heard. Those that thought they performed worse with the video input also had some comments. Several respondents said that they were distracted by reading the presentation on the video, so they actually felt themselves being distracted by reading it. Others thought it was because they spent time reading the information instead of concentrating on listening. And others felt that there was a cognitive overload of having to make notes while watching. That was too challenging for them. So to summarize all of the results for RQ1, as we saw, there was a statistically significant difference in performance on the audio input, but not on the video input. Both groups performed better on the first part, irrespective of the input format, which might suggest a fatigue effect, even though the input was very short at 12 minutes or 12 minutes 42 seconds. But texts were more lexically diverse and had more AWL types and tokens as a percentage when they had access to the video input, irrespective of whether that was the first part or the second part. With regard to the summary of the results for RQ2, then we saw that there were more reproductions in part 1 than in part 2 for both groups. The only exception to this was audio clause level exact reproductions for the video first group in part 2, but that was the only exception. Both groups we saw made use of the slides when they had access to these. In terms of part 1 exact matches, both groups had a high number of word level matches, but the video first group also had a high number of word level matches, exact word level matches from the slides, which is not surprising because they had access to the slides, but they also had a high number of clause level exact matches. For part 2, again, we had a high number of word level exact matches, but in both groups this time we had a high number of clause level exact matches. And the audio first group had a high number of word level and clause level exact matches from the slides, which again is not surprising because they had access to the slides. But when it came to paraphrasing, as we saw, both groups and both formats, for both of those, we saw considerably more paraphrases at the clause level from the audio. So they weren't paraphrasing the words so much, they weren't paraphrasing sentence level input, they were just paraphrasing at the clause level. For the test taker perceptions, again, just to reiterate that, we had 41% felt they performed better with video, but 15% felt listening only was better. But 21% felt listening was more difficult, and 14% felt listening and watching together were difficult and or they were distracted by the video. So briefly, some of the limitations. The rating scale was potentially a limitation. We used the CEFR overall written production scale. This was pre-CEFR companion volume. We started off with the processing text and the reports and essays scales as well, but unfortunately we couldn't continue to use all 3 scales because this wasn't possible due to time and cost implications. So we decided that the overall written production scale should encompass everything, so that's what we used. Obviously it would have been ideal if we could have developed a specific scale ourselves, but again that would have required a lot more work and would have been a validation project in itself. Another point to bear in mind was that there was only technically 1 text to summarize, whereas the CEFR at B2 requires synthesis. So this may have had a sort of ceiling effect and put a limitation on students receiving higher scores. So obviously, in an ideal world, you would have a specifically designed rating scale for a given task. But as I say, that would have been just beyond the scope of this. The other potential issue was the time allowed for the task. They only had 45 minutes, and out of the 116 participants, 9 said that they ran out of time. And you could see from the notes and from what they'd written that that was the case. So again, it might be worth extending the time, but we had to keep it to 45 minutes because that was the only amount of time that we were allowed in terms of data collection. So what are the implications and the conclusions? Obviously, the big implication of this is the consideration of the construct and what happens in the TLU domain. So what is it that you actually want to test? Do you want to test their task achievement in terms of surviving in an academic environment, or do you specifically want to test their listening ability? If it's the listening ability, then obviously by giving them extra support from the slides, then you're changing the construct. So obviously, if you just want to test whether they can listen, take notes, and transform that into writing, then we should remove the video input. But if we want to think about what happens in the real world, where they're more likely to have a PowerPoint slide, whether that's in the face-to-face environment or in a recorded input, then we should keep the video because that reflects how they would perform in the real world. But as we saw, it also provided scaffolding and resulted in more linguistically complex texts. If we think about the learner's perceived preferences, that might suggest that we should provide video input because more seem to prefer the video. And obviously, if you give them the video, then those who don't want to use the video can always look away or turn the screen off. So on that basis, it would suggest that it would be sensible to provide video input. And then the other thing to think about is keeping the input chunks short. We know that, even as adults, we have a relatively limited attention span. Now, for a teaching situation, this is fine, and for an EAP testing situation, this is also okay. But we need to think about, if we did keep the input chunks short, would this then reflect the TLU domain, or would we be moving away from what happens in the real world? So if we can, we should keep the input chunks relatively short, but if not, we do need to be aware of the impact of fatigue and how comprehension will drop off over longer lectures. So that's really everything that I've got to say. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, please shout.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I don't think I've ever actually heard you present on your PhD before, so it was great. There are a few questions in the chat, and I know we've only got 5 minutes, so we'll get on with those as soon as possible. So sorry, I'm scrolling back up now. So there's one here from Anne Starzikut. I know Anne's from Leeds University. Did you look at whether there were any distinct gender differences between which format was better perceived?
I didn't actually. Obviously, I could do because I've got all the data still, but I didn't specifically know. But that's a good question.
Yep, this one's from James Wiley. So when comparing podcast and vodcast results, are we comparing 2 different ways of testing the same ability, or are we comparing tests of 2 fundamentally different abilities?
Sorry, run that by me again.
Sorry, I didn't do a very good job of reading it out. When comparing podcast and vodcast results, are we comparing 2 different ways of testing the same ability, or are we comparing tests of 2 fundamentally different abilities?
That's a really good question. I think I would say in this case, because obviously the podcast specifically had a PowerPoint as input, it wasn't just a person talking, so it wasn't just about body language and so on. I would say we're comparing 2 fundamentally different abilities. If it was just a video just of me speaking and they didn't have any other input, I would say we're comparing the same ability, because we know again from the research that listening can also involve things like body language and gestures and so on. Those are parts of listening. But I think as soon as we start bringing in another input type, in this case we had the PowerPoint, I think we're changing the ability slightly, because we saw from the results it's then not just listening, we're then testing listening and reading and writing all together. So I would say, people may feel free to disagree with me, but I would say we're comparing fundamentally different abilities. Okay. Which is why I say we really need to consider what the construct is that we want to test. Do we want to test how they would survive in the real world where they would have access to this, or do we want to test their listening abilities?
I think that's really relevant now as well, with us doing more kind of online testing, and maybe people still kind of trying to make use of the same constructs that they had before. Okay, we've got another one here. How did you select the materials that have been used in the classroom?
Do you mean how did I select the lecture input? Maybe.
I'm not sure who that's from. Is it Hanan? I'm assuming that's what it means.
If that's what it means, basically, again, following the research, looking at the impact of topic knowledge that can be, well, it can be biased towards certain people if they have that topic knowledge, or it might be biased against people if they don't have that knowledge. I wanted to choose something that was a generally, it was a general interest academic subject. So the topic was culture shock. And because I was dealing with international students who might be studying abroad, or who might have studied abroad, or who might be thinking about it, I wanted to give them something that would also be interesting and relevant to them, but it was an area that they didn't really know anything about. But again, the feedback in the questionnaire suggested that most people didn't know about the topic, but they found it very, very interesting, and that helped them to concentrate as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got one more minute. Anita Mediana, what could you recommend in terms of the research method used for the future researchers in this area?
Definitely a mixed method approach, if that's what if I've understood the question correctly. Interestingly, Emma just presented to the rest of our team this morning on her PhD, and Emma made the really good point, which I completely agree with, that if you do just the qualitative side, you get certain insights, but you don't get the wider picture. If you do just the quantitative side, you get the sort of the big picture with the big numbers, but you don't get the detail. So I would recommend a mixed method approach with quantitative and qualitative, if that's how I've understood your question correctly. If not, then feel free to come back to me and re-ask the question, because I'm not very clever, and I might have misunderstood the question.
We're going to wrap up really soon, and this one you might just want to recommend a resource, but it was a question that was asked very early on, and it was from Peter Davidson. He said, could you explain the difference between knowledge telling and knowledge transformation?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, basically, Scardomeli and Baywriter 1987 is the reference, but basically knowledge telling is, in really, really short, simple words, is taking the information and reproducing it. Knowledge transforming is sort of synthesizing it, changing it, and as it suggests, transforming it to match what you want to produce. But that's a really, really, really super, super simplified version. Scardomeli and Baywriter 1987, if you Google that, that's the reference. But you'll find lots of references to it, because it's a really important paper. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks for the great responses to the questions. Rob, do you want to do a quick wrap up?
Thank you. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carolyn, for a fascinating presentation. I've been recording it, so with your permission, we'd like to share that on the on our website, so people who weren't able to make it today can can enjoy it too. So yeah, just
certainly.
thank you. So yeah, thanks to everyone for coming along. And just a reminder, we do have another event on Wednesday with Jan MacArthur talking about EAP and social justice and assessment. So we hope to see some of you there too. Thanks very much, Carolyn. Thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks for inviting me, guys.
Bye, everyone.